She dialed the cops on a black veteran, then her heart stilled as an officer stepped through the door. The little bell overhead let out a piercing chime as Harold eased the door open and entered. The aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee enveloped him in an almost tangible embrace. This diner was a relic of bygone days, with its checkered floors, time-worn booths, and a counter adorned with faded, vintage stools. It had weathered decades of morning rituals, the kind of joint where regulars' names were etched into the pulse of the daily grind. Harold straightened his military cap, its embroidered golden eagle catching the harsh fluorescent gleam. His knees throbbed from a long trek from the VA hospital, yet he had grown accustomed to the ache. At 76, he bore a life story that few could fathom from mere appearances. He noticed a vacant table beside the window and slowly navigated over, resting his cane against the booth's worn edge. Beyond, the sun hung low, gilding the parked cars and the flaking paint of an old gas station across the way. Behind the counter, a young waitress named Melanie observed him, her fingers tightening on the coffee pot as she scrutinized his presence. His rich dark skin, his worn military cap, and the measured cadence of his steps barely concealed a spark of disapproval in her eyes. Before approaching, she asked in a clipped, impatient tone, "Can I help you?" Harold returned a courteous nod, replying, "I'll have a black coffee and the breakfast special, if available." He never jotted anything on a pad. Instead, she folded her arms, shifting her weight onto one leg, and declared, "We're full." Harold blinked and scanned the room. At the far end, a couple wrapped up their meal. 2 booths remained utterly vacant. At the counter, a few seats were unoccupied. "Doesn't appear full to me," he stated evenly. She snorted a sharp exhale. "We're not serving right now." His fingers drummed a quiet rhythm on the table. He had witnessed this before, years past, in spots where he had been unwelcome. Back then, signs proclaimed it plainly. Now, it lurked behind counterfeit smiles and feeble excuses. He held her gaze steadily and asserted, "I serve this country. I earn my right to sit here and eat." Her expression hardened as she retorted, "I don't make the rules." The diner fell into a hush, heads turned and conversations paused as the tension thickened. An older man at the counter furrowed his brow yet remained silent. Harold had spent a lifetime choosing his battles, but now he was too weary to allow such behavior to push him aside. He leaned back slightly and murmured, "I'll wait." But Melanie's tolerance had evaporated. She spun on her heel and marched to the phone by the register. Without hesitation, she grabbed the receiver and dialed, "Yeah, I need an officer at Miller's Diner." Her voice cut sharply as she reported, "There's a man here causing a disturbance, he won't leave." Harold remained seated, merely watching her as the weight of history bore down once more. Yet a quiet intuition warned him this time was different. He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling around the untouched handle of his empty coffee cup. It didn't shock him, he had seen this scenario before, albeit cloaked in different language and hidden behind hollow rules. Decades had passed since someone first told him he didn't belong, yet that sting had never fully dissipated. Behind the counter, Melanie kept her back turned, with the phone pressed to her ear. She murmured, "He's still here." Her tone was low yet firm, "He's making me uncomfortable. He won't leave." Harold glanced at his time-worn hands, etched by labor and years. These hands had once cradled rifles under the scorching desert sun, had tended to bleeding soldiers in the silent hours of night, and had forged a life in the aftermath of war, even when the nation he served failed to stand with him. And now, those very hands were branded as a threat, without any provocation. He shifted slightly, catching the glance of a woman at the far end of the diner. Quickly, he diverted his gaze, fixating on her half-consumed plate of scrambled eggs. Elsewhere, a man wearing a trucker's cap nudged his companion, murmuring something inaudible, while others continued eating, reluctant to intervene. After hanging up, Melanie turned back, her eyes narrowing at Harold as if he were already marked as a problem. She smirked and added, "They're on their way, you'd best leave before they arrive." Harold remained still and replied calmly yet firmly, "I fought for this country, the very one you live in." She scoffed, "That doesn't grant you carte blanche." Her words hung heavy in the charged air. He had heard similar words on battlefields, in sterile government halls, in hushed conversations where people presumed he wasn't listening. The diner fell into a profound silence, even the sizzle from the griddle seemed muted. Then, a deep voice broke the stillness, "You sure about that, miss?" It came from the older man at the counter, the one who had been quietly savoring his coffee throughout the commotion. He set his mug down and turned in his stool, his face etched with years, his eyes blazing with a disapproval that caught Melanie off guard. Melanie's jaw clenched as she snapped, "It's none of your business." The man arched an eyebrow and countered, "It appears you made it everyone's business when you called the cops on a man simply trying to have his breakfast." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, vanishing almost immediately. She folded her arms again, declaring, "If you don't like it, you can leave too." The older man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head, "Honey, I've been coming here since before you were born. I've got far more right to be here than you." For the first time, Melanie's certainty wavered, but before she could retort, the piercing wail of sirens split the air. That sound rippled through the diner, forks clinked against plates and whispers quickened. Harold didn't glance up, he simply waited as red and blue lights danced across the front window. Yet the instant the officers stepped inside, everything shifted. The diner door swung open forcefully, its little bell rattling in protest. 2 officers entered, their boots thudding on the checkered floor, hands hovering near their belts as they scanned the room for the disturbance they had been alerted to. Harold stayed seated, his posture unaltered. He had weathered far more perilous situations. He knew not to rush or make any sudden moves. Melanie straightened her tone, adopting a rehearsed air of innocence. "Officers, that's him." She gestured with polished nails slicing the air toward Harold, asserting, "He refused to leave when I asked him. He's making people uncomfortable." A tall officer with a square jaw advanced, his stance rigid. His slightly younger partner followed close behind. Yet as they neared, something shifted. The older officer's expression altered, his jaw slackened, eyes widened, brows furrowing as though confronted by a specter, forcing him to halt mid-step. "Sergeant Daniels," he intoned, his voice low yet insistent, reverberating through the diner. Harold finally lifted his gaze, his deep-set eyes locking with the officer's. A long, stretched pause ensued, time slowing to a crawl until recognition shimmered in Harold's eyes. "Officer Caldwell, Harold," he spoke steadily, "didn't expect to see you here." Melanie's confident veneer shattered, her mouth parting in confusion. "Wait, you know him?" Caldwell disregarded her query, his hands now free from his belt, his posture relaxed as he turned to his partner and murmured, "Stand down." The younger officer hesitated, then retreated a step. Caldwell exhaled slowly. "Sergeant Daniels saved my life in Fallujah, pulled me out after my Humvee was hit by an IED. His voice, once authoritative, now carried a personal weight. The diner fell into dead silence. Melanie stepped back, stammering, "That can't be right. He was aggressive, wasn't he?" Caldwell's eyes snapped to her, cold and incisive. "That man aggressive?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You sure about that, miss?" She shrank back, glancing desperately around as if seeking an ally, yet the room had turned against her. The older man leaned back, arms crossed. "Yeah, honey, looks like you got tangled in a damn lie." A flush crept up Melanie's neck, and her fingers twitched at her sides. Caldwell returned his focus to Harold and, swallowing hard, said, "I'm sorry this happened." Harold fixed him with a long look, replying simply, "Not your fault, but the damage was already done, and everyone knew it." Melanie's breathing grew shallow and rapid, as though she struggled to process the unfolding events, while every eye in the silent diner locked onto her. The accusation she'd flung now hung like stubborn smoke. Caldwell stepped closer to Harold, his voice softer. "Sir, I should have checked in sooner. I didn't know you were back in town." Harold nodded slowly, his calm gaze steady. "Didn't expect a welcome party." A few people chuckled quietly, the older man smirked, and even Caldwell released a short, humorless chuckle, if the moment's weight hadn't been so heavy. Yet Melanie did not laugh, her face drained of color, fingers twisting the edge of her apron. She murmured almost inaudibly, "I didn't know." Finally, Harold focused on her, asking in a voice neither angry nor harsh but measured and patient, "Didn't know what? You didn't know who I was, Melanie, or you simply didn't care?" Silence followed. Caldwell sighed slowly and addressed the manager, a stocky man in a tightly tied white apron. "Is this how you run things here?" His tone was low but laden with authority, causing the manager to shift uncomfortably. The manager glanced at Melanie, whose wide, almost pleading eyes betrayed her, then shook his head and commanded, "Melanie, take off your apron." Her mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" "You heard me," he said firmly, "we don't allow this here." She let out a nervous laugh, adding, "But I was just doing what I thought was right," though no one supported her. The older man scoffed, "Nah, girlie, you were just testing what you could get away with." Her chest heaved too rapidly, fists clenching as she snapped, "This isn't fair, I didn't mean any harm." Harold tilted his head slightly and remarked quietly, "You called the cops on me, just for sitting down." Melanie's lip trembled, but she offered no reply. The manager exhaled through his nose and pointed toward the back door. "You're done here, gather your things and leave." For a moment, she seemed poised to argue, but then her shoulders slumped. She removed her apron, tossed it onto the counter, and exited silently. The door closed behind her, and just like that, she was gone. Yet her departure did nothing to erase the events. If anything, it underscored the tension. The hush over the diner lingered, heavy and thick, as everyone struggled to process the unfolding drama. Then a chair scraped against the floor. The older man leaned forward, shaking his head as he muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Damn shame, a man serves his country, returns home, and this is the thanks he gets." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The woman in the corner, who had earlier looked away, finally confessed, "I should have said something sooner. I saw what was happening, and I just..." Her voice trailed off, guilt flickering in her eyes. Harold regarded her with an unreadable expression. "You saw it, it wasn't even a question," he murmured. After a long silence, he nodded slowly, simply adding, "Now you know." Caldwell exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hate that this happened," he muttered, then turned to Harold. "You okay, sir?" Harold shot him a look that spoke of endured hardships, replying, "Yeah, but this isn't about me." The weight of his words settled over the room, not just about him, but about how effortlessly Melanie had dialed 911, how instinctively some chose to look away, and how long it took for anyone to speak up. The manager, silent since dismissing Melanie, cleared his throat. "Sir, I'd like to cover your meal on the house, and I want to offer a personal apology." Harold studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "I didn't come for a free meal." The manager's face fell a little. Harold reached for his cane and, with measured steps, rose to his feet. He withdrew a $20 bill from his wallet and placed it on the table, saying, "Just ensure this never happens again." The manager nodded, his face tight with a blend of shame and remorse. Glancing at Caldwell, Harold said, "Take care of yourself, son." Caldwell straightened and nodded firmly. "You too, sir." Then Harold strode toward the door at a steady pace. The diner fell silent again, this time not with ignorance, but with the heavy weight of realization, a burden Melanie and others now shared. The bell above the door jingled one final time as Harold stepped outside, where the late morning sun now climbed high, casting elongated shadows on the pavement. He paused momentarily, gripping his cane tighter before heading toward the sidewalk, while the silence in the diner lingered and no one moved, burdened by the weight of the events. Caldwell exhaled, rubbing his face. "I hate this," he muttered, frustration thick in his voice. The older man leaned back and asked, "What part, where he was disrespected or where he handled it better than any of us would have?" Caldwell released a short breath, almost a laugh but not quite. The manager stared at the $20 bill still resting on the table, its presence making his chest ache. "I should have intervened sooner," he admitted. The woman near the window shifted in her seat, shame flickering across her face. "We all should have." Outside, Harold ambled slowly, his cane tapping a measured rhythm on the sidewalk, as a few onlookers in the parking lot continued to stare and whisper, yet he ignored them, having nothing to prove. A few feet away, Melanie slumped on the curb, arms hugging her knees, eyes red and breath uneven. She wasn't quite crying, but the shock lingered. When Harold passed, their eyes met for a fleeting second. She almost spoke, almost offered an excuse, an apology, anything. Yet Harold did not pause nor slow. He simply cast a long, quiet look upon her, neither angry nor smug, just knowing. Then he walked past, stepping into the street and toward wherever he needed to go next, leaving Melanie alone with the crushing weight of her own choices, because some lessons are delivered not in words, but in silence. The world kept moving, a traffic light at the corner switched from red to green, a car engine rumbled to life, and somewhere, a dog barked. Yet inside the diner, and in Melanie's mind, time seemed to slow. She remained on the curb long after Harold vanished down the sidewalk, her hands fidgeting and chest tight, uncertain whether her anger was directed at the consequences or at herself. Inside, patrons resumed their meals, though the energy had shifted. The older man sipped his coffee in deep thought, the woman near the window remained unsettled, and the manager sighed as he removed the $20 bill from the table, his fingers lingering on it before placing it in the register. Caldwell, still near the door, watched it all and shook his head, muttering "damn shame" before exiting. Melanie finally forced herself to rise from the curb, her legs unsteady. She had spent the morning believing she was in control, that her actions bore no consequence, but now she doubted that notion. Such is the nature of truth, it persists even when unwelcome. Respect isn't reserved solely for those we know, it's due to those we don't, for those who have fought battles we'll never comprehend, who have earned more than merely a seat at a table, the inherent dignity of being seen as human. Harold sought no recognition, demanded no apology, nor did he need to prove himself, for true strength requires no validation, it simply exists. And the true lesson wasn't for Harold alone, it was meant for everyone in that diner, perhaps even for us. If this tale stirred thought or emotion, remember that stories like these aren't solely about one man or a single moment, they belong to all of us. Silence isn't always golden, sometimes it's a call to speak before harm is done. Let us strive to do better.